Archaeologists restoring 7 long-abandoned plantations in southern Louisiana uncovered the same unsettling find beneath every former slave cabin they examined. Hidden below the floorboards were small wooden boxes, warped by decades of dammed earth and decay. Inside each box lay an identical, deeply disturbing object. Within 2 days of the discovery, state authorities closed off all the sites. No official findings were ever released, and when local historians demanded answers, they were told the artifacts were culturally sensitive and would be studied behind closed doors. Yet one field researcher, who briefly examined the boxes before they vanished into university storage, was unable to forget what he witnessed. In his private journal, he referred to the contents as transfers de memoria memory braids. Each was meticulously preserved, wrapped in faded cloth and secured with thread the dark hue of dried blood. And before we delve deeper into the story of Belle Reve Plantation and the secret hidden beneath its ground, if stories like this fascinate you and mysteries buried in America's past, be sure to subscribe and leave a comment telling us which state you're watching from. We love knowing where these forgotten histories are being rediscovered. The discovery that would eventually lead archaeologists to those 7 plantation sites began on a humid morning in August 1853 when Belle Reve's newly appointed overseer noticed something unusual about the ground. Belle Reve stood along the Mississippi River in Ascension Parish, Louisiana, one of dozens of sugar plantations that had transformed the region into an economic powerhouse during the decades before the Civil War. The estate sprawled across nearly 800 acres of fertile bottomland, its fields stretching from the river levee to the edge of the cypress swamps. The main house, built in the French colonial style with wide galleries and tall windows designed to catch every breeze, rose 3 stories above manicured gardens where magnolia trees perfumed the air. But Belle Reve's wealth wasn't built on architecture or landscaping. It came from sugar cane. Thousands upon thousands of acres planted, tended, cut, and processed by the labor of nearly 200 enslaved people who lived in 2 rows of cabins behind the main house. Beyond the carriage barn and the overseer's cottage, the cabins themselves were simple structures 18 feet by 20 built of cypress wood that had grayed with weather and time. Each housed anywhere from 6 to 12 people, depending on family size. They had dirt floors, wooden shutters instead of glass windows, and chimneys made of mud and sticks that smoked badly when the wind shifted. The cabins sat in 2 parallel rows facing each other across a wide path of packed earth that the residents kept swept clean despite the constant dust from the fields. It was this path, worn smooth by decades of footsteps, that caught the overseer's attention that August morning. Thomas Gerard had only been at Belle Reve for 3 weeks. He'd been hired to replace the previous overseer, a man named Hebert, who died suddenly of fever in July. Gerard was 32 years old, originally from New Orleans, and ambitious. He'd worked on smaller plantations upriver and saw Belle Reve as an opportunity to prove himself capable of managing a large operation. The plantation's owner, Monsieur Richelieu, spent most of his time in New Orleans and visited Belle Reve only quarterly to review the books. Day-to-day operations fell entirely to the overseer. Gerard was walking the cabin row that morning, conducting his first thorough inspection of the quarters when he noticed an irregularity in the ground near the 3rd cabin on the eastern row. The earth there had settled unevenly, creating a shallow depression about 2 feet across. It looked recent. The soil was darker there, still slightly moist from a rain 3 days earlier, while the surrounding ground had dried to dust. He stopped and knelt, brushing his fingers across the depression. The soil was loose, not packed like the rest of the path. Someone had been digging here. Gerard stood and called for Henry, one of the enslaved men who worked as a carpenter and general handyman around the plantation. Henry was in his 50s, gray-haired and cautious in his movements, careful never to meet a white man's eyes directly. "This hole here," Gerard said, pointing. "You know anything about it?" Henry glanced at the depression and shook his head. "No, sir. Maybe just settled on its own. Old ground does that sometimes. This isn't old settling. This is fresh digging. Gerard studied Henry's face, looking for any sign of deception. Someone's been excavating under these cabins. I want to know why. Henry said nothing. His expression carefully neutral. Gerard made his decision. Get me a shovel. Within 20 minutes, Gerard had excavated down about 3 feet. The soil came away easily, confirming his suspicion that someone had recently disturbed it. And then his shovel struck something solid. He knelt and brushed away the remaining dirt, revealing a rectangular wooden box roughly the size of a large book. The wood was dark with age and moisture, but still intact. Simple construction. 6 pieces of cypress fitted together with small nails. No decoration or marking. Gerard lifted it from the hole. The box was surprisingly light. He shook it gently and heard something soft shift inside, like fabric. By this time, several people had gathered. Other enslaved workers who'd been nearby, drawn by the unusual sight of the overseer digging in the cabin row. They stood at a distance, watching in silence. Gerard pried open the lid. The wood had swollen with moisture and resisted at first, then gave way with a crack. Inside, wrapped in a piece of faded indigo cloth, was a thick braid of human hair. It was perhaps 18 in long, carefully plaited in 3 strands, dark brown, with hints of copper where the light caught it. The braid was tied at one end with a piece of red thread, and at the other end, the hair had been bound with what looked like a strip of cotton fabric. The braid had been preserved with some kind of oil or wax. Gerard could smell it, a faint herbal scent he didn't recognize. He held it up, examining it in the sunlight. "What is this?" No one answered. He turned to the small crowd that had gathered. "I asked a question. What is this doing buried here?" An elderly woman stepped forward slightly. Her name was Ara, and she was one of the oldest residents of Belle Reve, though no one knew her exact age. She'd been brought to Louisiana decades earlier. Some said from Virginia, others said from the Carolas. Her hair was completely white, her face deeply lined, and she walked with a cane carved from a cypress root. "It's remembrance," she said quietly. "Just remembrance, sir." "Remembrance of what?" R's dark eyes met his for just a moment, then looked away. "Of what's lost, that's all." Gerard rewrapped the braid and placed it back in the box. He had a plantation to run and quotas to meet before the grinding season began in October. He didn't have time for mysterious buried objects and cryptic explanations. But he was also curious and troubled in a way he couldn't quite name. "I want to know if there are more of these," he said. "Henri, get 3 men and start checking the other cabins. Dig down 3 feet near each foundation. Report anything you find." Over the next 2 days, they found 6 more boxes. Each one was buried in roughly the same location, just outside the front door of a cabin, slightly to the left, about 3 feet down. Each box was identical in construction, and each one contained the same thing: a carefully braided length of human hair wrapped in cloth tied with red thread. 7 boxes total, 7 braids. Gerard laid them out on the table in his cottage, studying them. The braids were different lengths, the shortest about 12 in, the longest nearly 2 feet. Different shades, too, ranging from very dark brown to a light raw bone. All were clearly well cared for, preserved with oil, plaited with precision. He'd been an overseer long enough to know that enslaved communities had their own customs, their own beliefs and practices that white owners rarely understood or cared about. He'd seen prayer circles and herb remedies, heard singing that sounded older than Christianity, witnessed rituals around births and deaths that drew on traditions from Africa or the Caribbean. But this felt different. There was an intentionality to it. The specific depth, the careful preservation, the identical red thread. This wasn't random. This was deliberate, systematic, part of some larger practice he didn't understand. That evening, he sent for Lara. She came to his cottage just after sunset, walking slowly with her cane. Gerard gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing, her expression carefully blank. "I want to know about these," Gerard said, indicating the braids laid out on his table. "And I want the truth." Ara looked at the braids for a long moment. In the lamplight, her face seemed even older, carved by time and experiences Gerard couldn't begin to imagine. "They're children," she said finally. "What's left of them?" Gerard felt something cold move through his chest. "What do you mean?" "When a child is sold away," Ara said, her voice quiet but steady. "Or when a child dies and there's no grave to tend, their mother cuts a piece of their hair. She braids it and keeps it close. It's a way of remembering, a way of holding on to what's been taken." She paused, her eyes moving across the braids on the table. "When there's no time left," she continued, "when the mother herself is dying or being sold away, she buries the braid, puts it in the ground where the child last lived, so the memory stays, even when she can't." Gerard stared at the braids. 7 of them, 7 children. "How long has this been happening?" "Long as there's been Belle Reve," Ara said. "Long as there's been mothers and children pulled apart. Long as there's been dying without proper burial." "Why the red thread?" "Protection, remembrance." "Different people say different things." Ara's hand tightened on her cane. "Does it matter?" "They're gone either way." Gerard was silent for a long moment. He'd grown up in New Orleans, the son of a merchant, and he'd entered plantation management because it was profitable, not because he'd given much thought to the human costs involved. He told himself that he was simply managing a business, no different from managing a factory or a shipping concern. The people were property, and property had to be maintained and organized for maximum efficiency. But sitting in his cottage with 7 braids laid out on his table, each one representing a child whose mother had loved them enough to preserve a piece of them forever, Gerard felt something shift in his understanding. "The owners," he said, "Levesque." "Does he know about this?" "No, sir. And it's better that way." "Why?" R's laugh was soft and bitter. "Because if he knew, he'd stop it. He'd say we got no right to bury anything on his land without permission. He'd say it's voodoo or conjure, something dangerous that needs stamping out. And then we'd have nothing left at all." She met his eyes directly, something she rarely did with white men. "You asked for truth," she said. "There it is. We bury our grief where we can. That's all. This is grief in a box 3 feet down where nobody looks." Gerard didn't sleep well that night. He lay in his bed listening to the sounds of the plantation after dark. The distant chorus of frogs from the swamps, the creak of cypress trees in the breeze, occasional voices from the cabin row singing low and mournful. He kept thinking about the braids, about the hands that had plaited them, about the children they represented. By morning, he'd made his decision. He called Henri to his cottage and returned all 7 boxes. "Bury them again," he said. "Exactly where you found them. And tell whoever needs to know, I didn't see anything." This inspection never happened. Henry Reed took the boxes carefully, surprise flickering across his face before he controlled it. "Yes, sir." "Thank you, sir." "I don't want thanks," Gerard said. "I just want those quotas met when grinding season starts. Understand?" "Yes, sir." After Henry left, Gerard sat at his table and wrote a brief entry in his daily log. Inspected quarters, all structures sound, no significant issues. Then he closed the book and went about his work. Sugarcane harvesting ran from October through December, and it required every available worker in the fields from dawn until well after dark. The cane had to be cut, stripped of leaves, loaded onto wagons, and transported to the grinding mill where massive rollers crushed the stalks to extract the juice. The juice was then boiled down in enormous kettles to produce raw sugar and molasses. It was dangerous, exhausting work. The cane knives were sharp enough to sever fingers. The grinding rollers could catch clothing or hair and pull someone into the machinery. The boiling kettles spilled over sometimes, splashing scalding sugar syrup onto anyone nearby. Injuries were common. Deaths happened every season. In early November, a boy named Samuel, 14 years old, small for his age, but quick with his hands, was working at the grinding mill when his sleeve caught in the rollers. He was pulled in before anyone could stop the machinery. They extracted his body in pieces. His mother's name was Charlotte. She was 30 years old, a field worker who'd had 3 children. Samuel was her middle child. Her oldest, a daughter named Willa, had been sold to a plantation in Texas 2 years earlier to settle a debt. Her youngest, a boy of 7 named James, still lived with her in the cabin they'd shared with 2 other families. Gerard was present when they told Charlotte about Samuel. She didn't scream or collapse. She simply went very still, her face turning to stone. Then she walked away from the mill across the fields and into her cabin. She didn't come out for 3 days. When she finally emerged, her hair had been cut short, hacked off roughly with a knife. She returned to work in the fields without explanation, moving through the cane rows like a woman made of silence. A week later, Gerard noticed fresh digging near Charlotte's cabin. He stood looking at the disturbed soil for a long time. He thought about stopping it, about maintaining some kind of order and consistency in how the plantation operated. But he also remembered those 7 braids laid out on his table and Ara's words, "We bury our grief where we can." He walked away without investigating further. Just when we thought we understood the purpose behind these buried boxes, the story of Belle Reve takes an unexpected turn. If you're feeling the weight of this mystery, hit that like button and share this video with someone who appreciates dark historical tales. Let's continue. Winter came to Louisiana such as it was. Cooler temperatures, rain instead of the summer's suffocating humidity. Occasional mornings when frost touched the fields. The grinding season ended in mid-December and the pace of work slowed slightly. Gerard had been at Belle Reve for nearly 5 months now. He'd settled into the rhythm of plantation management, learning the personalities and politics of the place. He'd identified the people who held influence in the enslaved community. Ara certainly, and a man named Marcus who served as a kind of unofficial mediator when disputes arose between families. There was also a woman named Marie who worked in the main house as a cook and who seemed to know everything that happened on the plantation before anyone else did. It was Marie who first mentioned the pattern to Gerard. She'd brought him his breakfast one morning in late December, coffee, rice cakes, and preserved figs. And while setting down the tray, she said casually, "You notice that all those boxes you dug up, they were all from the East Row." Gerard looked up at her. Marie was in her 40s, stout and sharp-eyed, the kind of woman who missed nothing. "What about it?" "Just interesting is all," Marie said. East Rows, the oldest cabins. "Been there since before I was born. And I've been here 32 years come spring." So maybe there's more than 7, Marie said. She arranged the dishes on his table with careful precision. "Maybe 7 is just what you found in the new digging. Maybe there's others deeper down from years past." Gerard sat down his coffee cup. "How many years are we talking about?" Marie shrugged. "Belle've been growing sugar since 1809. That's 44 years of mothers and children. You do the arithmetic." She left before he could ask anything else. That afternoon, Gerard went to the plantation's main house and requested access to the records room. Urola's estate manager, a meticulous Creole man named Baptiste, maintained ledgers going back to the plantation's founding. Birth records, death records, purchase and sale records, everything documented in Baptiste's careful script. Gerard spent hours going through the books. The numbers were staggering. Since 1809, Belle Reve had recorded the births of 137 children to enslaved mothers. Of those, 41 had died before the age of 10 from fever, from accidents, from diseases that swept through the quarters periodically. Another 63 had been sold away from their mothers, either individually or as part of family separations, when estates were settled or debts were paid. That meant 94 children who'd been born at Belle Reve had either died there without proper burial or had been taken away from their mothers while still young. 94 possibilities for those boxes buried beneath the cabins. Gerard closed the ledgers and sat in silence, trying to process what he'd learned. He'd known intellectually that the plantation system separated families. Everyone knew that. It was part of how the economics worked. Children could be sold for profit and mothers rarely had any legal standing to prevent it. But seeing it quantified name after name in Baptist's ledgers, each one representing a specific child and a specific grief, made it real in a way Gerard hadn't allowed himself to consider before. He thought about his own mother, who died when he was 12. He remembered the way grief had consumed his father for months afterward, how the man had withdrawn into silence and work, unable to speak about his loss. What would it have been like, Gerard wondered, to lose a child and not even be allowed to grieve openly, to have to hide that grief, bury it literally in the ground, mark it only with a braid of hair and a scrap of red thread. He left the records room and walked back to his cottage. As the sun was setting, the sky was stir with orange and purple, beautiful in an indifferent way. From the cabin row came the smell of cooking fires and the sound of evening conversations, people finishing the day's work and gathering in what little private time they had. Gerard made another decision that night. He would document the boxes, not to expose them or stop them, but to understand them, to create a record that someone someday might find meaningful. He began keeping a separate journal hidden in his cottage, where he noted everything he observed about the burial practice. When fresh digging appeared near a cabin, he recorded the date and location. When he heard about a child's death or sale, he noted it alongside the burial he suspected would follow. Over the next year, he documented 9 more burials. Each one followed the same pattern. A box approximately 12 by 8x6 in, buried 3 feet down, always to the left of the cabin's front entrance, always containing a braid wrapped in cloth and tied with red thread. Gerard never interfered. He simply watched and recorded. In August of 1854, Bell Reverend received word that Mzee Levesque would be visiting for an extended stay, 2 full weeks instead of his usual quarterly overnight inspection. He was bringing guests from New Orleans, several wealthy planters and their wives who wanted to tour sugar operations. This meant the plantation had to be presented in its best light. The main house was thoroughly cleaned, guest rooms prepared, and the grounds manicured. Gerard was instructed to ensure that all work areas were orderly and that the enslaved workers appeared well maintained and industrious. Part of this preparation involved improving the appearance of the cabin row. Baptiste, the estate manager, walked the quarters with Gerard and made a list of necessary repairs. Cabins that needed new shutters, chimneys that required rebuilding, several structures that had developed significant rot in their foundation timbers and needed to be torn down and replaced. 3 cabins were marked for complete demolition and reconstruction. All 3 were in the East Row, the oldest structures, the ones where Gerard had found the original 7 boxes. Gerard felt a sinking sensation in his chest. "Can't we just repair them?" Baptiste shook his head. "Foundations gone. Rot goes too deep. Cheaper to rebuild than try to save what's there." "What about the people living in them?" "We'll move them temporarily to other cabins during construction. Double up for a few weeks." It's been done before. Gerard knew he couldn't stop it. Levesque wanted the plantation looking prosperous for his guests, and that meant removing any structures that looked shabby or deteriorating. But it also meant digging up those foundations and potentially exposing dozens of buried boxes in the process. He went to find Ara. She was in the vegetable garden behind the cabin row pulling weeds with several other women. When Gerard approached, the others melted away, giving them privacy. "The 3 cabins at the north end of the East Row," Gerard said quietly. "They're being torn down next week. Foundations dug out, new structures built." Ara's hands stilled in the soil. She didn't look up. "I can't stop it," Gerard continued. "But I wanted you to know if there's anything that needs to be moved. It should happen before the work crew start digging." Ara slowly stood, brushing dirt from her hands. Her face was unreadable. "Why are you telling me this?" because it seems right that you should know." She studied him for a long moment. "You a strange kind of overseer, Miss Maybe. So most men in your position, they wouldn't care or they'd expose it all. Make an example. Stop it from continuing." "I'm not stopping anything," Gerard said. "I'm just giving fair warning." I nodded slowly. "Then I thank you for that warning." That night, Gerard watched from his cottage window as shadows moved in the darkness near the 3 condemned cabins. He couldn't see clearly, but he could make out the shapes of people digging, carefully excavating and removing boxes from the ground. He counted at least a dozen boxes removed before the work stopped and the shadows dispersed. When the demolition crew started work 3 days later, they dug up the old foundations and found nothing unusual in the soil. Mshlek's visit went well. His guests admired the plantation's efficiency, the quality of the sugar being produced, the organization of the operations. Gerard was complimented on his management, and hinted at a possible bonus if the next harvest exceeded expectations. During the visit, Gerard watched the way Lev and his guests talked about the plantation, about yields and markets, about the price of sugar in New Orleans and the competition from Caribbean producers, about new crushing machinery being developed in France. They talked about the enslaved workers the way they talked about the machinery or the cane varieties as tools, as investments, as factors in a complex economic equation. At one point, one of the visiting planters commented on how well behaved the workers at Belle Reverend seemed, and Lev credited Gerard's firm but fair management style. Gerard accepted the compliment with a nod, but inwardly he felt sick. He thought about those boxes hidden away, relocated now to secret places he'd never find. He thought about Charlotte, still working the fields with her hair, carrying grief that no one acknowledged. He thought about Tara, who'd lived through decades of this system and somehow maintained her dignity and quiet strength. These people weren't well behaved. They were surviving. After Le and his guests departed, Gerard returned to his routine. But something had shifted in him. He found himself questioning things he'd previously taken for granted. The legitimacy of the entire system, his own role in perpetuating it, the moral cost of treating human beings as property. He kept maintaining his secret journal, documenting the burials, trying to create some kind of record that might matter someday. In March of 1855, a young man arrived at Belle Reve who would change everything. His name was Caleb, and he'd been purchased from an estate sale in Baton Rouge. He was 23 years old, tall and lean, with intelligent eyes and a bearing that suggested he'd been educated. Unusual for an enslaved person. Gerard learned from Baptiste that Caleb had belonged to a lawyer in Baton Rouge who'd allowed him to learn to read and write, using him as a clerk and copist. When the lawyer died, his estate was liquidated, and Caleb was sold at auction. Le had purchased him specifically to work as an assistant to Baptiste, helping maintain plantation records. Caleb was quiet at first, clearly assessing his new environment, learning the unwritten rules and social dynamics of Belle Reverend. He was assigned a spot in one of the West Row cabins and began his work in the main house, copying figures from field reports into the master ledgers. Gerard didn't pay much attention to him initially, but about 6 weeks after Caleb's arrival, Marie mentioned something that caught Gerard's interest. "That new one, Caleb," she said while serving Gerard's dinner. "He's been asking questions." "What kind of questions?" "About the cabins, about families, about who's been here longest, and who knows the history." Marie sat down a plate of pork and beans. "He's careful about it. Doesn't push, but he's curious." "Thought you should know." Gerard nodded. "I'll keep an eye on it." But he was curious, too. What was Caleb looking for? He got his answer 2 weeks later when Caleb requested a private meeting. It was unusual for an enslaved person to request formal access to the overseer, but Caleb did it through proper channels, asking Baptiste to convey his request. Gerard, intrigued, agreed. Caleb came to the cottage just after sunset. He stood straight, met Gerard's eyes, not defiantly, but with a directness that suggested he was used to being treated as more than property. "Sir, I appreciate you seeing me," Caleb began. "What's this about?" Caleb hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I've heard things since I arrived here about a practice. Mothers burying boxes beneath the cabins. Boxes containing hair from children they've lost." Gerard's expression didn't change, but his mind raced. How had Caleb learned about this? And Gerard said neutrally, "And I want to document it." Caleb said properly, "Create a written record of what's being preserved and why." "Why would you want to do that?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "Because nobody else will. Because this system we live under, it doesn't value memory or grief when it comes from people like us. Everything gets lost. Families separated, histories erased, pain forgotten. These burials, they're an act of preservation. They deserve to be recorded." He paused, then added, "I know you've been documenting them. I found your journal." Gerard felt a spike of alarm. "You went through my personal belongings." "I was filing papers in your cottage when I knocked over a stack of books. Your journal fell out. I didn't mean to read it, but once I saw what it contained." Caleb met his eyes. "I read it all." Gerard should have been angry, should have punished this intrusion. But instead he felt something else. A strange relief. "What do you want?" he asked. "Partnership," Caleb said. "You have access to the official records, births, deaths, sales. I have the trust of the community. Together, we could create a complete accounting, names, dates, stories, a real history of what's buried here." "And what would you do with this history?" "Keep it safe," Caleb said. "Pass it on. Make sure that someday when this system finally ends, there's a record of what was endured and what was preserved despite everything." Gerard studied the young man standing in his cottage, asking for something that could get them both in serious trouble if discovered. "This is dangerous," Gerard said. "For both of us." "Yes, sir. If La found out, I know the risks." Gerard thought about the 94 children in Baptist's ledgers, about Charlotte and her silent grief, about moving boxes in the darkness to save them from discovery. "All right," he said. "But we do this carefully and nothing leaves this cottage. Understood?" "Understood." Over the next year, Gerard and Caleb worked together on what they privately called the Memory Project. Caleb, with his ability to move through both the enslaved community and the administrative spaces of the plantation, gathered information that Gerard could never have accessed alone. He learned the stories behind the burials, which boxes corresponded to which children, how the mothers had preserved the hair, what the red thread meant in different family traditions. Gerard provided the official records, dates, and documentation that gave structure to the stories Caleb collected. Together, they created a detailed ledger that told the hidden history of Bellerive. They learned that the practice had started in 1812, 3 years after the plantation's founding, when a woman named Abina, who'd been brought directly from West Africa, buried the first box after her daughter died of fever. Abina had taught the ritual to other mothers, adapting African memory practices to the specific circumstances of the plantation. The red thread, they learned, came from different traditions. Some